Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Scott Sinclair. I'm the Senior Manager of Programs here at Cancer and Careers, and I want to welcome you to this evening's webinar. For those of you who are listening in on your phone, please let us know by sending an email to cancerandcareers@cew.org with your name and your phone number that you're dialing in from. That way we can confirm your attendance and make sure you receive all of the relevant follow-up information after the webinar. Now, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, Cancer and Careers is a national nonprofit and the only program of its kind solely dedicated to empowering and educating people with cancer to thrive in their work environment. This is a list of all of the free programs and services that we offer. Our comprehensive website, available in both English and Spanish, is the heart of everything that we do. There you can find various support services, including our resume review service, and access to career coaches. Our educational blog and newsfeed are both rich resources for those who have been diagnosed, their caregivers, employers, and healthcare professionals can stay current on topics related to work and cancer. Our free publication library, available again in both English and Spanish, provides tangible, easy to digest information on working and looking for work after a cancer diagnosis in both hard copy and PDF formats. We also offer numerous events each year, from hour-long webinars like this one right now to our full day events. And I will come back on after Rachel talks to tell you a little bit more about some of our upcoming events after the presentation. Now, for those of you who are seeking continuing education credits, this is a list of all of the organizations who have accredited today's webinar, as well as the required steps for getting a certificate. This information is also available on our website, and a link to the evaluation and the post-test will be shared at the conclusion of the webinar this afternoon or this evening. So please take time to complete it at that point. But if you're not able to do it tonight, that's perfectly fine. You'll get an email sent to you tomorrow, Thursday, October 5th, no later than 5 p.m. Eastern time with the link there. And also for those of you planning on requesting continuing education credits, our accrediting bodies require us to share this slide and let you know that there are no conflicts of interest to report. And as you might know, Zoom has a lot of great features that you can use to interact with the event today. The chat box you can see in your features panel, feel free to use that and communicate with our speaker, our staff, and other attendees. However, it's important to note that the chat box is not private and will show your first and last name. So that's something to be mindful of when and if you decide to engage in the chat. There's also a Q&A box on your screen. And if you have any questions throughout today's presentation, drop them in the Q&A box, not the chat box. We might miss it if it gets in the chat box, but drop your questions in the Q&A box and I will come back on afterwards and Rachel and I will go through all of your questions, or as many questions as we can get to today. And we know the importance of privacy, so there is the option to submit questions anonymously, and we'll do our best to answer everyone's questions. But if we don't get to yours today, or if you think of something later on, feel free to send us an email at cancerandcareers@cew.org, and we will get back to you there. We want to thank, in part, Genentech and QVC for offering this 9th year of the Balancing Work and Cancer webinar series, which was created to provide anyone whose life has been touched with cancer with concise, targeted information about work-related issues that arise after a diagnosis. And we also want to recognize Cancer and Careers as year-round sponsors who support all of our core programming and allow us to continue providing all resources and services free of charge. Now, following a cancer diagnosis, challenges around navigating the workplace, expressing your needs, and managing side effects due to treatment are common. A strong and clear communication strategy can make a big difference. To guide you along this afternoon, I would like to introduce you to Rachel Becker. Rachel is the Deputy Director here at Cancer and Careers. She's been here for 9 years, having previously worked as Head of Client Services at Care Planners, as well as in a clinical capacity at New York Presbyterian Brooklyn Methodist Hospital. She completed a fellowship in psycho-oncology at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Again, following Rachel's presentation, there will be a Q&A, so please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box, either at the bottom or the top of your screen. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Rachel.
Thank you so much, Scott. And welcome, everyone. We're so happy that you decided to spend this time with us this afternoon or this evening, whatever time it may be where you are. So for this second session on communicating effectively, I first want to say that if you missed the last session that we did, don't worry. You're still going to be able to follow along with today's content, and hopefully we'll walk away with some meaty information to use in your daily life. And then if you want to go back and watch that first part later, you can find it archived on our website. So in this session, we're going to do a brief overview of some of what we discussed last time in terms of what effective communication actually is. And then we're going to shift into exploring in a rubber meets the road style, and we'll talk about best practices for using social media and other online platforms to create an online brand, tips and techniques for having conversations at work and when looking for a new job. And then we'll also spend some time looking at job search through a communications lens. So, as those of you who did join us for the last session will remember, we spent some time defining some terms and ideas to really get started thinking about the big picture of what it means to communicate effectively and be an effective communicator in your work life. And we're going to start today doing a quick review of some key points related to that discussion, both as a refresher and to help set the stage for anyone who couldn't join us in September. Communicating is something that most of us do every day to one degree or another. So from that perspective, it's probably fair to say that everyone here already has some degree of expertise in communication in their own right. However, even with that practical experiential expertise, there's always room to grow and learn how to be a more effective communicator, particularly because it is so common to experience as challenges to communicating well, and it's not always intuitive how to navigate them. So let's start with the question, what is communication? Well, one definition is that it is a process through which information, ideas, or emotions are shared between two or more people, and it can occur in a number of ways. It might happen through audible communications, such as spoken words, and it may also involve sounds that are not words, such as nonverbal sounds like grunting or sighing, etc. But of course, not all communications are received through our ears. They may be written out or shared using sign language. And our behavior around others and our body language can also convey information or clues about what we're thinking and feeling. And it's important to note that sometimes our communications happen in ways that are thought out and deliberate, but that is not always the case. Sometimes we end up sharing ideas or information based on a spur of the moment decision or impulse. And sometimes details get shared with others subconsciously without us even knowing that we're doing it, like when we're nervous and our hands start to shake or we start tapping our foot repeatedly. So on this slide, you can see a list of some of the core elements of effective communication, including that effective communication is a two-way street, and it involves both sharing our thoughts and ideas, while also investing energy in receiving and absorbing the ideas that are being shared by whomever else we might be communicating with. This means not only being mindful to get across our own perspective in a way that is clear and organized, but also really paying attention to what that other person is trying to get across and considering what they're bringing to the table in terms of their own perspective. Communicating effectively may also involve asking clarifying questions. So if you're not entirely sure what the other person or people you're communicating with are trying to get across to you, it is much better to make sure everyone is on the same page up front rather than wishing later that you'd ironed out details better beforehand. Expressing gratitude when it's appropriate is also a best practice. While you might not assume that the person you're communicating with knows that you're appreciative, the reality is that usually people don't know what we don't tell them directly. And simply saying thank you can go a very long way in terms of effectively communicating. Another best practice can be summarizing what was discussed at the end of a conversation, either verbally before you walk away from that moment, or written in an email that gets sent around after the fact. And this is because effective communication isn't necessarily limited to being a one-time event. In fact, it should be something that happens regularly so that people remain on the same page as circumstances evolve. Sometimes that's a 10-minute check-in. Maybe it's weekly meetings of an hour or more. There's no one right way to do it. The key is that the information is communicated back and forth in an ongoing way. In fact, sometimes effective communication very purposely takes place over the course of more than one discussion. Additionally, effective communication incorporates emotional regulation, which means having the goal of staying centered so that what you're feeling doesn't play too much of a role in how you're expressing yourself. This is not to say that we want to leave all emotion out of work conversations. We are humans after all, and emotions are one way that we show humanity. And that can be a very important piece to, in fact, maybe even weave into your communications at the workplace. But sharp words or intense energy may land differently with your coworkers than it does with your friends and family, and sometimes can have long-term consequences that are hard or even impossible to move on from. Asking for help when you need it is also an essential part of communicating effectively. Every single person on this planet, no matter their health status or their job title or any other personal characteristics, needs help from time to time. So asking for it should not be something you shy away from, particularly at work. And of course, effective communication should result in a clear understanding of any next steps. And this point can be particularly key, at work certainly, but also when you're having conversations with your healthcare team, which is something that probably all of you, and if not, certainly many of you are quite familiar with at this point in time. It can also help to prepare in advance for some of these conversations and to make sure to remember all of the questions you want to have in the limited appointment time you may have. Similarly, some conversations with family or other loved ones may benefit from advanced preparations, such as if you're sharing news about your diagnosis or updates to your treatment plan. And then these bottom two bullet points really start to ground us in the conversation we're going to have today. It can be really important to think strategically about what you post online, whether that's on social media, or a blog, or anywhere else you might be posting, since our online behaviors can have a real impact on our work lives. And lots more to come on that in this presentation today. And of course, it goes entirely without saying at this point that strategic communications can make a big difference in work-related context, whether you are currently employed or looking for a new opportunity, or both. So, now that we've reviewed some of the critical components of our last session, we're going to start digging into the topic of social media. And as we do, I want to take a moment to talk about some of the good things that social media can bring to our lives. We hear so much in the news today about the quote unquote dangers of social media, and those are very real, so I don't want to undermine them. And if you've attended other Cancer and Careers events, you've most likely heard us talk about some of the complexities it can create in the work arena. We'll cover those again today as well, of course. But before we do, I think it's really important that we acknowledge some of the benefits, because those are really real too. And there wouldn't be a need to talk about the potential complexities if so many of us weren't drawn to these benefits. In particular, we hear so frequently from people who have received a cancer diagnosis that social media has been really helpful in decreasing their feelings of isolation during or after treatment, sometimes during both. Not only does it allow us to connect with our existing friends and family, maybe you even use it to keep your loved ones up to date on what's going on with treatment, but it's a channel for making new connections with others who are living through a similar experience. Receiving support from a person able to relate firsthand to what you're going through can be tremendously important, as can providing support, and having that kind of community is an incredibly powerful thing. Social media can also be a very efficient tool for creating a curated feed of information. A lot of people will get their news from their X feed, their formerly known as Twitter feed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously, it's always good to stay on. That's another benefit of social media. It's always good to stay on top of what's going on in the world around you. Excuse me just a second. Okay, shifting our perspective to work. Online communications are important in that they can be a source for prospective job opportunities. And you'll see that we have a stat pulled here from an article that says that 1 in 5 employers won't call someone for an interview if they can't find them online. So it's wise to have a strategically created online presence. But beyond that, it's also the case that many recruiters nowadays will reach out to potential candidates that they find on LinkedIn. Communicating through online platforms might actually bring opportunities to you. Now, this data is from the same Harris poll that found that 78% of current employees believe that their employers should maintain an appropriate social media profile. And this was across a variety of industries from retail to healthcare and beyond. Engaging in communications on social media is also a way to stay relevant in the world of workers. More and more social media and other means of communicating online are becoming part of the way that jobs are done. So yes, if you're looking for a new job, staying relevant is key, but also continuing to invest in understanding the online landscape if you've been at your existing job for ages can be important as both you and the organization evolve. So these are some of the potential benefits of online communication. And as I mentioned, there's also some complexity associated with communicating online. And it's important to talk about these complexities as well for the sake of having a full 360-degree understanding so that when you're making choices about how you're going to communicate online, you can make informed decisions that you feel good about. So this is very likely not the first time that you've heard about the challenges of maintaining privacy online. And when it comes to mainstream social media platforms like Instagram and TikTok and so on, we certainly often hear a lot about the issues that can come up with privacy and so on. Now, what you see on this slide is an image that shows the revenue Facebook generated between 2009 and 2021 by segment. And the social network's advertising revenue, and sorry, this is by to 2022. In 2022, it amounted to 115 billion US dollars, which is quite an increase you can see even from 2022 and certainly over the year since 2009. Now, the reason that this happened is because Facebook and its child sites like Instagram, they're always making new deals and new sales in order to get more money. And what they're selling to advertisers is personal information about people like you and me who use these platforms. So yes, Facebook and X, formerly Twitter, and all those other platforms have privacy settings. But even if you make your profile as protected as possible, no account is entirely private. So what we recommend as alternatives are 2 sites that you may have heard of called My Lifeline or Caring Bridge that allow you to opt into the highest level of privacy. So those are great to check out. And we have on our website a guide to how to use these platforms and how to make sure that you're fully informed about your privacy options on My Lifeline and Caring Bridge. Now, there's also a very effective step you can take to protect your privacy before ever even sitting down at a keyboard or opening an app, and that is to develop a personal disclosure plan. This includes making clear decisions about what, if any, information about your cancer experience you're going to share online and off. And when we think about the virtual world, where you are going to share in terms of specific website or blogs. So as you're thinking through what is going to work best for you personally, it's a good idea to spend some time considering the potential long-term impact of the online disclosure. Now, it may be the case that some of you have already disclosed at work and everyone at work is being truly supportive. That is an outstanding situation to be in. I wish every person who had the unfortunate reality of a diagnosis would find themselves in those circumstances at their job. But the fact is, the internet doesn't go away. So it's important to think beyond right now and consider possible impacts that might happen months or perhaps even years down the road, even if the moment now is really relatively good. None of us can predict the future. And the reality is that you may unexpectedly find yourself looking for a job 5 years from now, or your supportive supervisor may move on and be replaced by someone who starts Googling their new staff. And there's no way to know how that new person is going to respond to the information they find. Then once you've made those decisions, communicate them with the people in your network, whether they're friends and family or people you're connected to online. And even after you share those preferences, it's still a good idea to monitor what others are posting so you have a sense of what's out there. Finally, it's key to remember that even if you've passed the moment of initial consideration, you can redefine your disclosure and communication plan and preferences at any time. And while it might not change what is already out there, there can still be value in making new and different choices. If thinking about how exactly to go about building up your professional online brand feels intimidating to you, you are very much not alone. But it can help to think about doing so as an opportunity to tell the story about who you are as a working person by taking a strategic approach to posting that allows you to be in control. And that starts by taking a look at what's already out there by Googling yourself. What comes up and in what order? And if your goal is to put your best self forward for potential employers, does that work for you? If not, what might work better? Those popular social media sites can be deployed strategically to change how you show up in web searches. More on that on our next slide. But you also might consider setting up a professional web page or blog so there's a dedicated online destination that talks about who you are. We recommend running each post through a filter. You can ask yourself questions such as the ones you see in the gray box on the side of the screen. And it's a way for you to be mindful before you click share or post. Because while you can delete posts that no longer represent your interests, keep in mind that they may still be out there, even though they'll be harder to find. Now, to flip that coin, let's talk about the various mainstream social media platforms and how to post on them strategically as you build out your online brand. Social media sites like LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook rank very high in Google searches. So becoming active on these sites and presenting a voice that represents who you are as a professional is an excellent way to elevate your brand. That said, keep in mind that the different platforms have different audiences. LinkedIn is considered a secondary resume to many employers, so you'll want to keep it up to date. For example, if you got a new certification or wrote a blog related to your field that you're particularly proud of, about your industry, if you got promoted, things of this nature, those are what you want to be sharing on LinkedIn. But the key is to keep it work focused. It is not the place to post about the awesome novel that you just read. Unless maybe you work in publishing, then maybe you would talk about the awesome novel that you just read. Linked at the bottom of this slide is CAC's archived webinar on building an effective LinkedIn profile, which you may also want to check out. Twitter, formerly known or what is formerly known as Twitter, what is now known as X, is another platform that can be deployed strategically to give employers a curated view of your professional self by sharing interesting articles you've read or re-sharing thought leaders who you admire and providing commentary through your professional lens. Facebook, on the other hand, is not typically the platform where employers go to dig into who you are as professionals, so there's more flexibility to post about your personal interests. However, it is worth noting that employers will sometimes look at Facebook profiles to find out about who people are on the human level. So it's still wise to be deliberate in what you're posting to avoid rude comments or profanity that might not land so well with someone who doesn't know you. Now let's shift to talking about work-related conversations. Now, what I'm about to say may feel a bit on the obvious side, but I do want to quickly mention whether you're currently employed or looking for a new work opportunity or both, your communications typically are going to fall into one of two categories: spoken, and we would consider sign language communications to also fall into this category, and written. This slide has examples of each, and there may be others that occur to you as well. We're going to spend the rest of the webinar talking about these. But before we do that, there's one key difference that I want to point out, which is an incredibly critical piece of communicating effectively. It applies to written format, and that is that written format allows you to go back and proofread. You can make sure that what you're saying is clearly expressed if you want to, depending on the communication, depending on the kind of relationships you have in your life. You could run it past someone else to make sure it sounds okay. However, it is often the case with communicating effectively or communicating in spoken format that you can't go back and proofread after the words are out there, but you can often spend some time doing some planning in advance. And so some ways to think about doing this include writing out a script or an outline of key points to help drive whatever conversation you're planning for. This is a pointer that isn't only helpful for people who might be experiencing brain fog from treatment, who want to make sure that they don't leave out key points. It can be helpful for just about everyone. There is a strategic benefit as well to writing things out because it allows you to play with the order that you present your topics in and identify anything that feels redundant or so on. So you can kind of proofread in advance, if you will. It can also help to think through potential comments, questions, or topics that might come up and catch you off guard, such as questions about your treatment or how you're feeling. We're going to go through a number of those and how to plan for them in just a few minutes. Identify and plan to address any boundaries or expectations you might need to set or manage. We have an archived webinar on boundaries on our website that you can go check out for those of you who are interested in taking a really deep dive into this topic. Also, using friends and family to rehearse work-related conversations before they happen can be an incredibly useful tool. And I think people often underestimate how helpful role-playing can be, or they write it off because the idea feels silly or makes them feel uncomfortable. And I get that, I really do. But over the years, I've worked with a number of people who have been really surprised by how much of a difference it can make to actually practice making the words come out of your mouth while you're interacting with another person. So to anyone whose reflex is to dismiss this idea out of hand, I'd really encourage you to give it a try. Okay, so now we start getting into the how-tos of planning responses to comments and questions. And we'll spend the next few slides going through some examples. But first, I do want to flag that these examples are really directed at people who have disclosed their cancer diagnosis to at least one person in their workplace. However, we know, and as we talked about during the last session, many people make the choice not to disclose because that is what is right for them. So if that's you, I encourage you to keep in mind that the concepts here can still be applied even if you haven't disclosed, in order to help you navigate some tricky conversations. So the particular verbal pattern that you see outlined on the screen is something that we call the swivel. And I call it a verbal pattern because there are no prescribed words. It is a practice that involves acknowledging a comment or question that was made, and then inserting a big and right in the middle, and moving, shifting, swiveling the topic of conversation over to something that you feel more comfortable to talking about. So for example, you can see on this slide, if someone were to approach you and say, my uncle had cancer, you might say, I'm so sorry to hear that. That must have been hard. And what did you think about the meeting that we had yesterday? So in this case, this person is driving the conversation back to work. You might drive the conversation back to something else that's personal, but not related to your cancer. And we're going to go through a lot of examples that are built on this technique. So something I think it's often hard for people to recognize, particularly those who want to be viewed as valuable employees, regardless of their health status, is that everyone has limits. And it's important to take the time to figure out what yours are and what triggers them, especially while juggling work and cancer treatment and recovery. In our personal lives, it may be easy to tell someone that we need space or to be left alone. However, work culture often makes that hard to do, which means it's critical to find productive ways to communicate your limits. And learning to set these boundaries on the job might enable you to decline certain types of requests, such as staying late for non-essential tasks or being given new projects to complete. And although it can be difficult to say no, figuring out how can help you become a better employee. You won't be overburdened with extra work, and you won't feel trapped by every ask you receive. And as I mentioned, we have a whole archived webinar on this subject on our website, so you can check that out. The key to setting effective boundaries in the workplace is crafting language that feels natural and communicates the no message in a way that is still professional and team-oriented. You'll notice they involve expressing gratitude and then sharing an explanation that is rooted in being human, that could apply to almost everyone in a workplace, versus giving an explanation rooted very specifically in a cancer diagnosis. And also flagging that there's a sort of swivel here because the speaker is saying, well, I can't do that right now, and then demonstrating a positive character trait, like being conscious of timelines or excitement about future opportunities. Role playing can be particularly helpful here, again, if you're not used to saying no. Of course, there are a whole spectrum of comments that you may encounter in the workplace, and the one we have on this slide falls into the category of well-intended but off-putting. Someone's boss says to them, "You've been looking so exhausted recently, I didn't want to overwhelm you by adding more to your plate." And this is a great example of something that, seems like it's coming across well, but if, maybe you want more added to your plate. Maybe this person is saying something that you feel is a little bit judgmental. Well, you might respond to this by saying, listen, I appreciate your concern, but work is a key part of my overall well-being. And in fact, last night I had some ideas about this project that I'd love to share with you. Again, the key is finding language that's relevant to your circumstances and sounds like you. And I guarantee that you will get better at swiveling the more you practice it. Another area around which we've seen a lot of dialogue in the cancer community is the use of battle language when discussing the experience of going through treatment for cancer. And I do want to be very explicit in saying that in no way am I implying that using fight metaphors is inherently bad. If fight metaphors are a concept or language that resonates with you and works in your circumstances, then we are all for that. But we do know that it doesn't work for everyone. In fact, I've met quite a few survivors over the years who find it very upsetting, which is also valid. And for them, it can be very jarring when someone else assigns that language to their personal cancer experience, particularly if it's a coworker or survivor that doesn't know them all that well. One of the things that we believe in very strongly at Cancer and Careers is that each person should be in charge of their own narrative and how their story is being told. And to that end, how can one address it in the workplace if a coworker says something along the lines of, I so admire how you are battling your cancer. I think that kind of fighting spirit is so critical to defeating it. Again, one approach might be to swivel and say something like, thank you for appreciating how challenging it can be to balance everything I have going on. And while I have you, the budget recommendations you provided need to be tweaked slightly. Could we set up a meeting to discuss it further? This approach drives the conversation back into the realm of work-related topics without having to engage directly with the battle language that was used. And while this approach is going to work for some, others might prefer to take a more direct approach and make it a teachable moment. So saying something like, thank you for appreciating how challenging it can be to balance everything I have going on. I understand why you think that mindset and attitude are so important to navigating cancer, life, and work. But I do want to share that while for some people, the battle language is very inspiring, for me, it's actually not. So I would be grateful if we could talk about my experience using less loaded words. Again, this is an approach that is not going to work for everyone. And if you do decide to take it, it's important to be open to the idea that it may invite further conversation, which requires you to provide further guidance to your coworker. Or it may create a situation where you leave that person to absorb what you just said. And it's also possible that you would get another response entirely. But the point is that you'll want to be comfortable managing whichever reaction you may generate. So the comment that we've shared on this slide falls into the category of what we call outright insensitive. And you can see the possible response that we have included here is pretty substantive. So for the sake of time, I'm going to leave you to read it on your own. But what this slide really drives home is the idea that it can be useful to sit down and think about how you personally might respond if someone were to make a comment like this, so that your reply uses language that sounds like you and you don't find yourself caught off guard by any emotional reaction you have. And then subsequently, because of that, saying something that you wish you hadn't. Let's now move towards the communications that you're likely to encounter during the job search and why effective communication is so important during this time. So let's see. Overall, clear communication is absolutely key to opening the door to potential interviews, whether that's through networking or a cover letter or a well-constructed resume or LinkedIn profile. All of these modalities involve making the best use possible of a limited amount of space. In interviews as well, you have a limited amount of time to communicate to the interviewer that you are the savviest, most qualified candidate for the job. And doing that is a skill that requires practice. So let's take a look at some of these things individually. What is an effective resume? Well, simply put, it is a written communication that is easy to read and understand, and that keeps a specific audience in mind, meaning that you might use different versions of your resume to apply for different jobs if those different jobs require different specific skills. Your resume should be a succinct summary of capabilities and accomplishments. Other critical points: no more than 2 pages, one for a recent college grad. Your resume must have a profile or summary at the top. You should include keywords for your software to pick up. And avoid using phrases such as effective communicator or detail-oriented, which are pretty generic. It is much better to focus on keywords and accomplishments from your job. And I will also put a plug in for Cancer and Careers free resume review service, where anyone who has been diagnosed with cancer can upload their resume and we'll pass it along to a career coach. Now, when it comes to cover letters, I think the 2 best pieces of advice are: don't regurgitate your resume. This is your opportunity to draw pros and parallels or highlight an experience that makes you uniquely suited to your role. You might drive the person's attention to your resume, but you want to try to use your cover letter to expand upon what's in your resume so you're not being redundant. Also, and this is so, so important, don't use a generic letter that doesn't tie to you. And It also needs to tie to the specific company or job in question. I have read a lot of cover letters over the years, and I am here to tell you that it is very clear when someone has submitted a generic letter that they've probably also submitted to other potential employers. It is much more appealing when someone has taken the time to spell out the specific ways that they connect to a job or organization. I mentioned earlier that we have a full hour-long webinar on building an effective LinkedIn profile, but we did want to share some key points with you today. So for when you're creating your profile, you're going to want to write a compelling description of who you are as a worker so that potential employers or contacts will want to keep reading. Ask for substantive recommendations from people you are already connected with in your network. Be specific when you reach out to make these requests. Things like, "Hi, Jane, I'm updating my LinkedIn profile and would love for you to talk about the XYZ project we worked on together." Post status updates regularly so that your profile doesn't become stale and start to have be an inaccurate reflection of who you are. Also, joining groups that are relevant to your professional interests and actively participating in them is another great way to not only ensure you're using LinkedIn effectively, but it is an excellent way to network. And that brings us to our topic of networking. So according to a number of resources, about 85% of jobs are found through networking, and it can happen both online as well as in person. So knowing how to best approach it in either format is important. It's understandable if networking may feel awkward or uncomfortable. In fact, that's pretty common. But a great way to ease some of that anxiety is to have a general list of questions on a variety of topics to get the conversation flowing better. And you can see a few of those suggestions on this slide. Important to note that they don't have to be solely focused on professional experiences. Talking about hobbies, interests, talents, it's always a good way to get people more engaged and open. And as you brainstorm other questions and conversation starters, the thing that you're going to want to look out for is to make sure that you're not coming off as intrusive or overly personal. Rather, the goal is to appear curious and interested in learning about the other person. So here we've included a number of best practices for communicating effectively while you're networking in person. You want to make sure that you're that you are remembering people's names. Make small talk or conversation. I know a lot of people it's often something that gets a bad reputation, but knowing how to do it is really important to initiating conversations or carrying on a conversation for people when networking. Overall, trying to avoid topics that have a kind of heavier feel, such as politics or religion. You want to stick to topics that are more approachable. Also, proper networking etiquette is that if you spend more than 15 minutes talking to someone, send a follow-up email. And in those emails, try to use the word "you" more often than the word "I." If you tell them that you're going to do something like send your resume or forward a news article you discussed, be sure to do it in a timely manner to ensure you build on any good first impressions you generated. Now, when it comes to online networking, one key difference between Facebook and LinkedIn is that it is much more acceptable to reach out to people you haven't met yet on LinkedIn. In fact, if you're looking for job opportunities, this is a highly recommended way of networking. That said, if you do reach out to someone you don't know personally, it's important to know exactly what you are asking for as you reach out to them. Most people are willing to help if you are able to articulate exactly what you need from them. And remember that networking is a reciprocal process. So try to work in the offer to help them out some way in return. And to that end, it makes sense to be strategic about your connections. Reach out to people who it logically makes sense to have as part of your network. Hopefully, once you've deployed some strategic networking, you'll find yourself with some interviews lined up. So in terms of best practices, a key factor to keep in mind is that what is most important to a prospective employer is how you the applicant can solve their problems and meet their needs. So that's what you should be prepared to speak about. Tell stories about how you solved problems at prior jobs and use specific examples. Also, don't be afraid to make the exchange conversational. One of the things hiring managers are assessing for is personal fit, so don't shy away from back and forth exchanges. If a reviewer asks you a question you're not quite sure how to answer, don't be afraid to ask clarifying questions to ensure that you responded with the information they were looking for. And also, and this can be absolutely critical, you must send a thank you note after every interview to every person that you met with. If you do a group interview, it can be tempting to send a single email that CCs all of your interviewers. I get that, but resist that impulse. Sending individual notes recognizes the individual contributions of each interviewer, and it leaves a good impression. So here we have some best practices for communicating effectively during interviews. These include preparing beforehand. This could include researching the company or planning or drafting, planning answers to potential questions that you might be asked so that your responses sound polished. And it's also important to know that how you communicate in an early stage interview may be different from how you communicate once you've already had one or two meetings. Remember, in those early stage interviews, your cancer experience may be front and center in your mind, but it is unlikely to be the case for the interviewers. Your primary focus in these moments should be describing your interest in the job and selling yourself. And then in later stage interviews, you'll want to be strategic about disclosure if that feels important to you. Again, this is generally not required. We talked about this more in the last session, which you can go back to on the archive. But if it does feel important to you that a potential employer know your history before they hire you, you would want to share that in a later stage interview. Employers are not supposed to ask you about health information during interviews, and some interviewers know that, some interviewers don't, but it's possible that should you make the decision to disclose information about your diagnosis in a later stage interview, that you might be met with kind of a blank stare because the interviewer is aware that they're not supposed to talk about it. So they may not be entirely sure how to respond, and they might be taking a second to think about it. So don't let that throw you if it happens. When interviewing, the swivel can also be a very useful tool if a question comes up that's related to your cancer, or for some other reason you prefer not to spend a lot of time unpacking whatever you've been asked about. Simply refocusing the conversation can help put the recruiter or interviewer at ease, and it puts the conversation back on the right track. The key is to be future-focused, non-specific, and brief. It's important to acknowledge the question that was asked. Of course, that is central in any swivel. And then you want to bring the interviewer's question back to conversation about the job in question, back to conversation about your desire to get hired, the skill set that you bring to the table that makes you so uniquely qualified, et cetera, et cetera. You can see a couple examples of swivel interviewing on this slide. And we also have a few more here, which again, I'm not going to read for the sake of time so that we can get to our Q&A. And we are about to do just that because we have come to the end of the content slides for today's presentation. I do want to point out that we've pulled together here some resources and tools about communications on the job that are available from Cancer and Careers. This is also similar tools and resources for those of you who might be looking for work, calling out particularly the mock interview the article on mock interviews and the interview cheat sheet, which are great to help you practice responses to interview questions ahead of time. And we have some more resources for looking for a job here. That's a big one. And then finally, our top takeaways for today's session are right here. Hopefully you will be leaving here with awareness that online communication considerations are important, an understanding of techniques to approach conversations that can help you remain in control, and that many aspects of the job search require effective communication in both spoken and written formats. So that brings us to the end of today. And I'm going to pull Scott up to tell us how it doesn't bring us to the end of today. It brings us to the end of the presentation part of today. Here's Scott to talk about Q&A.
Thank you, Rachel. That was really great. We have a few quick things here before we get to Q&A. If you have not gotten your question in, there should be a button at the bottom or the top of your screen for Q&A. Feel free to drop your questions in there, and we will do our best to get to them. Before we get there, I just want to go through a few of our upcoming events. We have 2 more webinars left for the year. The next one is going to be on November 1st, and that is balancing work and caregiving. So we that with any caregivers in your life. It's a really unique situation that probably does not get as much attention, and we really want to have as much of you as we can here. And then our final webinar for the year is Marketing Yourself, Job Search and Beyond, and that is going to be on December 6th. And then we're also coming to the end of a special Spanish language webinar series, which is an Ask the Expert series. The last session is going to be October 10th next week. And that is with Nieves Cuervo, who is a psychiatrist, and she's going to be there answering questions. They are going to be conducted in Spanish, but again, we hope you can share that with any Spanish speakers in your life, or if you yourself speak Spanish, we hope to see you there. And then finally, we have our West Coast Conference coming up on Saturday, October 21st. West Coast meaning we're having it in the West Coast timeframe, but it is going to be on Zoom, and we hope that you can join us from wherever you are across the globe. Now, these are a few more resources for you to have on hand. And we also have Rachel's contact information. If I can get the slide to go, there we go. Rachel's contact information, as well as all of our social channels. We hope you can stay in touch with us and reach out if we don't get to your questions today. And while we go into Q&A, I'm going to just leave up this slide with all of the CE PDC requirements. Again, you will have the link to the evaluation will pop up at the end of the session today, and you'll get an email tomorrow with all of that information as well. So, Rachel, I have a few questions for us here, if you're ready.
Great. I am.
The first question I have here is, I just returned to work after a couple months away while I underwent treatment. I can barely get through my work because people keep stopping by to check in on how I'm feeling. I understand that this is really well intended, and I appreciate everyone's concern and care for me, but how do I politely tell them that I don't want to keep answering the same question?
So I think that this is a moment where the swivel might serve you. And there could be a very quick acknowledgement. And I'm sorry, did this person share the specific question that was being asked of them?
Just how they're feeling.
How they're feeling. Okay. All right. So what's great about how you're feeling actually is, well, it's a tricky one, because often when we're going through something that's serious and medical and someone asks how you're feeling, what they mean. They're asking, how is it going with the cancer? Maybe there's a little look of concern. How are you feeling? Yeah, like they're trying to get under the hood. Is everything okay? But the great thing about this question is that it's actually pretty broad. For example, I did not think through the climate in my apartment before this webinar where I'm presenting from, and I put on a blazer and I am now very hot. So I'm feeling kind of warm, actually. Scott, would you like to step outside and get some air with me? Maybe take a little break?
Yeah, that sounds great. I could go for a walk around the block.
There you go. So there are all kinds of ways you can answer that. Hungry? Do you want to come grab lunch with me? I'm really excited to be back. You might even talk about what you're thinking instead of what you're feeling. That is an acceptable way to respond to that question. It doesn't literally address the feeling piece of it, but you could say, actually, I was thinking about the meeting that we had the other day, and you could drive it back to something work related. So the key is to just, as much as you can, and for this person, this is clearly something that's happening a lot. So you know that it's going to happen and you know how it makes you feel. But part of the reason why we recommend role playing with these questions and preparing for them in advance is so that you can be kind of like, get a sense of what's going to come up for you emotionally and how it's going to make you feel, so that you know that that happens. You can just say like, yep, this is what was this feeling, was the feeling I was expecting. Got it. Thanks. And then you just, let go of it being a big thing that you have to react to and respond with whatever your swivel might be.
Yep, I think that's great. The next question I have here is, I've been pretty open about my diagnosis on Facebook, but I didn't realize that people other than my family or friends might be able to see those posts, and now I'm worried. Is there anything I can do to hide those posts?
So you can go back and delete posts. Facebook does allow you to do that. All of the social media platforms allow you to do that, as far as I know, as of the last time I checked, unless they might have changed things during this webinar. Or I missed something, that's possible too. Anyhow, so you can delete posts. What becomes tricky about deleting posts is the fact that if somebody shared it, or if you tagged someone in the post might also exist on their timeline. And so there can be complexity in terms of, can you get them to take it down? Do you ask them to take it down? And then, we sort of don't know where else they might exist. So the idea is to, get rid of anything that you don't want up there anymore. People do it all the time. Strategically post things that you're comfortable with people seeing, that you want at the top of your feed. Most employers are not going to go 16, 17 pages into a social post. They're probably not even going to go to page 3 or 4. They're just going to look at what's right up there up front. And so you can replace strategically with things that you would like people to see. And then the other piece, of course, is having prepared swivels for anything that might come up. So if someone mentions that they did see something that you posted online, how might that come up? What might you say in response to it? That's some preparing that you can do that, and maybe you'll never have to use them, but it can give you peace of mind that you would know how to handle it if it did happen.
Yeah, I think you can also look, if you don't want to necessarily delete everything, you can look at your privacy settings. Some of them, can be tricky and complicated, especially like Rachel said, when other people are sharing posts of yours. But, taking a look at that and making sure that like your account really is private and only your friends and family, there are different levels of privacy, and there's one that should be only friends and family. And that means that you can approve everybody who's seeing things, and it's not a fail-safe method, but it can be a stopgap measure at the very least while you figure out your swivels and how to address things too.
Exactly. And yeah, and Catherine had made a similar point in the chat as well, that you can always change your privacy settings, and that's true. Where this got complicated was, and I think I heard the question correctly, correct me if I didn't, but I think this person was saying that this was about posts that were already up. So this was about posts that had gone out into the world before they were thinking about the privacy settings. So there can be a kind of, bigger life outside of their own feed.
Yeah.
So
the next question, and I think this is going to be our last one because we are sadly almost at time. But the last one I have here is, I've been out of work for a while, and I've gone through treatment, and I'm starting to feel like it might be time to start looking for a job. However, my energy levels are still low, and the thought of networking makes me tired just thinking about it. Is it really necessary?
Yeah, you are in very good company. The thought of networking makes a lot of people feel very tired, as does the thought of cover letters, as does the thought of resumes. I mean, the whole process can be very draining to think about. Networking in particular can feel really intimidating because, it's strangers and we can feel put on the spot, and public speaking is just a common phobia that a lot of people have. It is necessary though. And Scott, you look like you're going to say something.
And I just think it's something that if you think of it as big, overwhelming thing, it's going to be big and overwhelming. But when you break it down into small pieces, I think that's what's going to get you through it. So you don't need to go to a conference of 400 people and walk around and do the grip and grin thing. It can start as small as making a LinkedIn profile and finding people that you know there. It can be as small as sending an email to a former colleague saying, hey, I'm looking for a job, let me know if you hear of anything. It can be
that's exactly what I was going to, that was exactly where I was going to go with the response. That so you start step by step. And you can also, I sometimes encourage people to just practice going up to strangers in even a non-job context. So, everybody loves to receive a compliment. It's really easy to go up to someone whose hair color you're admiring in a Starbucks and say, who does your hair? It looks fantastic, right? And that's just practicing starting a conversation. There's no stakes. So there's lots of ways that you can step by step yourself into the practice. But Scott makes a very good point, do it one step at a time. Today, I'm going to reach out to a new connection on LinkedIn. See what happens. Or I'm going to reach out to 5, because then, if one person, it may not respond. But if you reach out to 5 people, maybe you'll get 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 responses back. Take it in manageable steps. And it is a necessary process. It is very common to not feel great about it, but there are a lot of things that you can do to make it feel easier.
Absolutely. I said that was our last one. I have one quick one that I'm not even going to ask Rachel about. It says, I want to talk about cancer openly, but at an appropriate time and place, website, etc. Do you have a suggestion on how to do that? Rachel mentioned Caring Bridge or My Lifeline. Those are both great ways that if you want to share updates with your family and your close friends, those websites can be completely locked down. If you want, you have to approve everybody who goes into it. And it's a great way to do one update and everybody can hear. I know I've been on them for different family members or friends that have been in various situations. And it's nice to, I don't have to bother anyone texting them, how are you? And I can go on and read the updates there. So those are 2 things to keep in mind should you want some sort of online presence update for people that you really do trust without it getting too farther out. And again, you have to look at the privacy settings and make sure that everything is locked down, but those are designed specifically for people in different medical situations or whatever it may be.
Yeah, My Lifeline was actually part of the cancer support community and was designed specifically around cancer. And while Scott was talking, I pulled up a link to our publications page where you can download our Maintaining Online Privacy Guide for free, and that will walk you step by step through how to make your profile as private as possible on those 2 platforms.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much for everything. If we didn't get to your question today, we're so sorry, but please shoot us an email, cancerandcareers@cew.org. We have somebody checking that Monday through Friday, and we will get back to you as soon as we can. If you think of something later tonight, tomorrow, next week, we're always available to coach you through things. And thank you so much for joining, and we hope that we'll see you next month. Good night.
Take care, everyone.